really appreciate your guys' time and your interest in this work just because of how important it is to our mission. So just a quick introduction. I'm Rahil. I lead the Access team and I'm on the North America Coordinating Committee. This is my second year on the committee. Vanessa, would you like to quickly introduce yourself?
Yes, my name is Vanessa. I am also on the Access team. This is my first year on the coordinating committee, and I'm part of the Western U chapter in Canada.
And hey guys, my name is Sahil. Helped restart the Yale UAEM chapter. And this is also my first year on the Access team. We're here to just answer any of your guys' questions in terms of how to organize on campus. Um, and we hope that we can sort of be a resource for you. And we can help start coordinating some of our chapters together to lead some more national efforts. Yes, so to take it off, I'm going to hand it off to Vanessa. If you guys aren't already aware, today we're going to be talking about a access framework, which we hope that you guys can bring to your TTOs. And we're hoping to give you guys a kind of understanding of what this access framework is, where it comes from, what its stipulations are, and how you can advocate for it on campus. So I'll just pass it off to Vanessa and she'll take it here from the rest.
Awesome, thank you. So as many of you know, we have a drug problem, more specifically, a global lack of access to medicines. You've probably heard estimates that at least 10 million people die each year due to inaccessibility of essential medicines, medicines that are readily available on the market, but are often priced out of reach. We live in a time of amazing pharmaceutical breakthroughs, but too often these medicines are tied up with high prices, complex patents, and licensing deals that are designed to put profits ahead of people. The whole system that gets drugs from research labs to people who need them isn't working the way that it should. It's set up to benefit pharmaceutical companies while billions of people are left without access. The next slide. For those who are unfamiliar with the process of drug development, this is a step-by-step visual. The first two stages of research are typically conducted at a university, and in almost all cases, it will be publicly funded through grants from the federal government. Now, how this part relates to the downstream access is that the technology or the intellectual property is licensed out from the university to, say, a pharmaceutical company. So you will then take this through clinical trials, as you can see here, before the drug comes to market at a price point that they set. As you can imagine, trying to decrease the cost of a drug after it's gone through this whole process can be met with a lot of resistance. That's why at UAEM, we want to intervene in the process right here at the preclinical research, where the technology is going to be transferred. Introducing equitable and transparent policies within the licensing agreement will ensure that the downstream access is greatly increased. So a couple of important definitions that I mentioned on the previous slide. The Technology Transfer Office is the office at a university that's in charge of all the IP transfer and licensing agreements. And the licensing agreement itself is a contract that will allow a party to take the drug through the trials and eventually put it on the market. So, for example, if a vaccine is invented at a university, they'll want to license it out to, say, a pharmaceutical company to run it through trials and get it onto the market. This negotiation will be done through the Technology Transfer Office that's affiliated with the university. And the actual contract is called a licensing agreement, which has everything in writing for how that technology can be used. I want to read this quote from the former director of the licensing office at MIT, Lida Nelson. She said that if universities adopt sound licensing practices, the universities will not only help stimulate investment in research on diseases that primarily afflict the poor in developing countries, but also ensures that products of the research are affordable and widely available in those countries. Ensuring global access is one of the central goals of intellectual property management. Universities confront two main obstacles in their efforts to achieve the goal. Obstacle one that she outlined is a lack of awareness. This is primarily referring to technology transfer offices, as many of them are unaware how much the licensing they do has downstream impacts on access to the end product, particularly in low and middle income countries. There's also a lack of awareness for how they can impact this within their offices and within the policies in their agreements, which then leads to obstacle two, which is the lack of consensus on best practices to promote global access. Now, this is where ETEF comes in. ETEF very clearly outlines the best practices, which we will be going through very thoroughly after we discuss a few earlier iterations of global access framework. So in this webinar, we're going to briefly go over those three early licensing frameworks that attempted to tackle obstacle two. And then I'll pass it over to Sahil, who will explain the most recent framework, ETAF. We'll then discuss an advocacy guide, and we'll have a bit of time at the end for questions. Okay, so you can see this timeline here. Attempts to create a framework for promoting global access has been around for some time, with the main one that we'll be discussing dating back to 2007. As time went on, several other frameworks came out, such as SPS and GALF, and now the most recent one, ETAF, in 2020. So we'll begin with Autumn's 9 points. The organization that came out with this is the Trade Organization for Universities Tech Transfer Professionals. These 9 points really boil down to ensuring that the technology is commercialized for use and retaining the rights to conduct further research. The ninth point, though, directly addresses access and obstacle two. As you can see here, it suggests adding provisions that will address the unmet needs through improved health and agricultural solutions for previously underserved populations. This was truly the first recognition that universities had a responsibility in global access. In a way, it planted the seed for change, but it did so without providing guidance on how to implement these changes in practice. Amazingly, though, this had a huge buy-in, and 118 research institutions endorsed the 9 points. The Statement of Principles and Strategies for the Equitable Dissemination of Medical Technologies came out shortly afterwards in 2009. This was a more fleshed out version, the 9 points. It was also authored by Autumn, but this time is a more developed version with contributions from several other universities. And while it was more concrete in its principles and strategies than the 9 points was, such as including things like tiered pricing in developing countries with private markets, cost-based pricing, reserved rights, the wording of it was still vague, and signing on didn't actually come with a strong commitment to use them in licenses. The SBS was endorsed across the US and Canada as well, but it was on a much smaller scale as it just reached 13 universities. And the Global Access Licensing Framework was written by UAM in a much more direct focus on licensing provisions. The two main goals of GALF is for the licenses to preserve future innovation by ensuring that IP isn't made to be a barrier for future research, and also that the licenses protect access to the final end product. This was quite concrete on its own and really served as a precursor for ETAF, which is a much more comprehensive framework. And I will now pass it off to Sahil, who will be going through the ETAF.
Hey guys, we had a question before we started about the AAP that I quickly wanted to touch on. The AAP is another tool we have in our toolkit as a licensing strategy that we try to advocate to TTOs with. The ETAF is a much more comprehensive framework that sort of touches on how universities can best leverage their positions early in licensing to be able to affect improvements in downstream global access. Um, and so we're going to be talking about the ETAF today. If you guys have any questions about the AAP and the ETAF comparisons between the two, please email us. Our email will be at the end. So the ETAF is crudely structured into three major parts, with the base being the goals that lead to the principles that can execute those goals, and then the modalities by which you can work on those principles. What I mean by that is that there are three main goals in the ETAF. The first is to improve global equitable access to health technologies. The second is to promote innovation and open science. And the third is to improve transparency of health technology transfer. Throughout this presentation, we're going to be reiterating and explaining upon a white paper that the IPIP Clinic, it's a student law clinic at Georgetown Law School, put together for us on the ETAF in comparison to the other frameworks described prior. Before I go on, many of you are fairly well aware of why it's important to have increased access as well as innovation in pharmaceutical marketplaces. But I often get a question of why do we care about transparency? Why is transparency important? And so I just wanted to quickly touch on why this third goal is critical to the ETF and one of the three pillars before we kind of start moving on. Transparency, in a nutshell, is important because oftentimes when health policymakers or groups like ourselves try to advocate pharmaceutical companies to bring medications down to what we would consider a fair price, it's hard to understand what that price might be because we have no idea how much it actually costs to develop that medication in terms of the R&D, as well as how much it costs to produce that medication. And so something that the that UAEM as well as the WHO has signed on to recently is this idea of how can we make the supply chain of pharmaceutical technologies more transparent so that health policymakers and governments can start to better, regulate these pharmaceutical firms without bursting innovation or leading to any sort of without be while being able to properly regulate the industry. So in terms of transparency at the TTO, it's important for us, for the TTO to be transparent because it allows us to hold them accountable. We can't know whether a TTO is acting on its access goals unless we have an idea of what their licenses look like. And it also allows TTOs in posting their licenses on their websites to start raising awareness to the best practices in access licensing that they're using so that hopefully other TTOs can start picking up and building off of the work of others. In terms of the pharmaceutical space, as I talked about before, policymakers often have a very difficult time working with the pharmaceutical marketplace because pricing is so opaque, how much it costs to develop a medication is so opaque. And so one of the key tenets of the ETAF is getting universities, as well as the pharmaceutical licensees of these technologies, to commit to making transparent how much money actually went into the development of this technology, as well as how much of that money came from public funds to see what the public's return should be. So the nine main principles of the ETAF are listed here, and we're going to go through them one by one. The first is social responsibility. It's the idea that universities have a responsibility to advance human health and alleviate suffering through their research. And this is especially true given the significant public funding that a lot of universities in the US and Canada receive to conduct their research. And so, in adopting the ETAF, we hope to advocate to universities to acknowledge that they have a responsibility to ensure that their technologies are um, become available and affordable in low and middle income countries, as well as to underserved people. And the modality by which universities can do this is to commit to global access licensing via the ETAF principles to follow. Principle two is we want universities to limit the monopolies that result from the technologies that are developed on campus. Monopolies, unsurprisingly, they prevent equitable access in that generic manufacturers or competitors can't enter the market due to patent barriers. And that means that pharmaceutical companies can set the price at whatever they want. And there have also been instances where pharmaceutical companies might not choose to commercialize the technology in a certain country, and in which case it might be very difficult for a competitor to come in and do so. And so what we advocate for via the ETAF is for universities to include not to primarily use non-exclusive licenses when working with health technologies, which means that the university can choose to work with other manufacturers in the event that the university does not meet its access goals. Um, and if an exclusive license is necessary for, say, the commercial feasibility of a product, we would advocate for a university to sign on to an exclusive license limited to high-income countries only, but keep the option of non-exclusive licenses in low and middle-income countries open, such that if a licensee does not bring the technology to market in those countries at an affordable price, the university can then license out the technology to another manufacturer who can do so. The idea here is to just hold the licensee accountable to their access goals that are discussed. The third principle of the ETAF is that oftentimes we see that the profit incentives in the pharmaceutical marketplace can drive private companies to prioritize profits over patients. If universities are intent on ensuring that their technologies are accessible, we consider it to be in their best interest to retain as many IP rights as they can to ensure that should this technology not come to market fairly, they will still have some ability to find a new manufacturer and to be able to do something about it. Um, Sometimes this is impossible, and in those cases, we want to ensure that even if ownership is transferred from, say, the university to a pharmaceutical company, we want to make sure that the ETAF principles are contractually kind of included in those licenses and to make sure that access is protected in the licensing agreement. Principle 4 of 9 is step-in rights. We want universities to reserve the right to allow other manufacturers to step in if access goals are not met. As you can tell, these principles sort of build upon each other, similar to a um, um, I guess I would explain it as if a university had entered an exclusive license, say with the pharmaceutical company, what that means is that the pharmaceutical company is the only company that can be able to produce that drug um, worldwide unless there's some sort of field of use limitation. What a step-in right does, if it's included in such a license, is that it would allow the university to say, hey, you haven't met your access goals that you promised in this contract. We're going to issue a non-exclusive sublicense so that somebody in a manufacturer in a low to middle income country can start producing this drug um, and start bringing it to patients on fair terms. Other modalities of step-in rights are field of use limitations, which means that the licensee um, can only market the patent only applies to certain areas. And if the university deems that the licensee is not doing a good enough job in bringing the drug to market, they can fully or partially revoke the license through these step-in rights. The fifth principle is reach-through clauses. Um, Basically, this means that any innovation that follows on the patent that the university licenses out, or any sublicense that the licensee grants, I'll say that differently because I think that's very confusing. No matter what happens to the technology, basically, the access considerations and protections will be stuck to the technology. It's basically what a reach-through clause does. I like to think of it as like getting a tattoo, in the sense that it's like a permanent sort of marking on the patent and on the contract that any use of this technology, whether that's a follow-on product or you're letting somebody else make the product, the access considerations and protections will still hold through. The sixth principle is for universities to limit market and data exclusivities in their patents, licensing agreements. Um, so far, we've talked about patent exclusivities, which, as you guys are aware, block other competitors from being able to use any sort of proprietary idea or technology. But there are also non-patent exclusivities that regulators can sort of grant that can block a drug from entering the market, even if it's off patent, for example. And so we want to make sure that when universities are signing these agreements, they're also being mindful of any market or data exclusivities that might exist in LMICs. A data exclusivity basically means that nobody else can use the data that a pharmaceutical company used to get approval of their drug. And a market exclusivity basically means that no other generic manufacturer can enter the market, even if the drug is on off patent. And so we want to see universities basically waive their exclusivities in these processes. The seventh principle is we want to make sure that universities are sharing the data and research findings from any of the technologies associated with them. Um, UAM's clinical trials transparency campaign has sort of honed in onto this issue where maybe 1 in 4 trials go unreported. Oftentimes, these are trials that fail or get like negative results. And this is alarming because without trials being published and their results being reported, oftentimes it's hard for scientists to be able to build on the discoveries that researchers are doing that's already been funded and completed. and it leaves oftentimes clinicians with less information on how to effectively prescribe a medication. And so, in the spirit of innovation, Principle 7 is to share the data and research findings resulting from any sort of technology developed on campus. Principle 8 is transparency of funding and R&D costs. Um, as I talked about before, it's very important from a policy point of view to have an idea of how much it costs for a medication to come to market, such that, say, Doctors Without Borders wants to procure a drug and they're trying to find a fair price. It becomes very helpful to know how much it costs to bring the drug to market, how much the innovation cost, and how much it costs to produce the drug, so that they can start negotiating a fair price and making sure they're getting the best bang for their buck and saving as many lives as possible. And the ninth principle is accountability mechanisms. We want to see more transparency in how universities license out their medications, but we also want to see more transparency in the pharmaceutical marketplace from the licensees and the pharmaceutical companies they work with. One way we foresee doing that is by having the tech transfer offices basically post the licenses that they've made with universities online with the access protections provided in unredacted form. Um, Sometimes, if they post a contract online, they'll redact a lot of the main information. We want to make sure that the access protections are publicly reported so that groups like ourselves can know that the tech transfer office is meeting its access goals, and then we can then follow the licensee and make sure they meet their access goals through as stipulated by contracts. Another modality is by asking TTOs to submit annual reports on their access goals. Most TTOs already put out annual reports, but if you look through them, they'll often be figures on their commercialization revenue and how much money they've been bringing in. We want to also see what their global health impact has been. And another way we can hold TTOs accountable is to potentially have something like a global health advisory committee established at a TTO. The idea being that TTOs are often staffed by lawyers and by scientists and experts who are really good at licensing, but may not have as much experience in actually developing a technology for low and middle income countries. It's something that fits more into the global health side of things that faculty in global health, for example, might be able to better advise on. And so what a global health advisory committee would be to pull from faculty in the university who might be able to advise the TTO on how best to ensure access in their licensing agreements with more of an angle on global health. And it would be staffed, in our view, best by both faculty as well as students, potentially a UAMer, or somebody else who's been elected to the position who can help advise the TTO on technical matters of equitable access licensing, as well as potentially provide support on a few issues on sort of technical matters. So before I get into this hypothetical exercise where I basically reiterate what the ETAF is via example, does anyone have any questions? Because I've sort of talked your guys' ears off and I've said a lot of things and I'm sure you guys have a lot of questions. All right. If no questions, you can always shoot a question into the chat, um, and we can go from there. So basically, to illustrate what the ETAF is, I want to pose a hypothetical to you guys. I want you to imagine that the year is 1921, and you've discovered a wonder drug, and your name is Frederick Banting, and you're working in the University of Toronto, and you've discovered this cool new drug called insulin. The question is, what are what do you ought to do as the inventor of this technology, and what actually happened, and how can that better help us understand what the ETAF is? And so, if you guys are familiar with the story, in 1921, Frederick Banting discovered insulin, and he famously sold the patent for about $1 because he said, insulin does not belong to me, it belongs to the world. Unfortunately, Frederick Banting did not have the ETAF handy, or else he would have known that it is perhaps sometimes better to retain the IP rights. It was a very Frederick, Dr. Banting clearly acknowledged the important value of this technology. He acknowledged the social responsibility of the University of Toronto to be able to develop this technology equitably for patients. And so his plan was to basically sell the patent to the University of Toronto so that he and his patent wouldn't become a barrier for this technology being developed. The only problem is that in letting go of his own IP rights and leaving it to the University of Toronto, he, in a sense, allowed like the University of Toronto full control over how this technology was going to be developed. And what the University of Toronto basically did is that in the late May of 1922, they signed an exclusive licensing agreement with Eli Lilly that allowed the company to manufacture and distribute insulin for free of charge for a year. But after that year, the company was free to charge however much they wanted for insulin, and they could patent any innovations on their product. So basically, the University of Toronto, um, by signing an exclusive agreement, tied themselves to Eli Lilly, and let Eli Lilly sort of have essentially transferred owner. I wouldn't say that, um, but they allowed Eli Lilly to have sole production of this technology in the U.S. Without any sort of recourse from the university in terms of what they would do in the event that this medication became unavailable. They had a very noble goal of making sure that this medication was free for its first year of use. But subsequently, as we kind of know today, nowadays there are three big manufacturers, the big three manufacturers of insulin, that being Novo Nordisk, Eli Lilly, and Sanofi. In 19, I think 23, the University of Toronto licensed out again through an exclusive license the patent on insulin to the Nordisk Insulin Foundation in Britain for European use. And now Eli Lilly and Novo Nordisk and Sanofi together capture more than 95% of the insulin market. Point being is that by signing this exclusive licensing agreement, the University of Toronto essentially allowed Eli Lilly, Novo Nordisk, as well as Sanofi to be able to sort of capture the market in such a sense that today, as you guys are probably well aware, at least in the US, the price of insulin has skyrocketed. And in many countries, it's now become unavailable and unaffordable as some of these companies are also transitioning their production of insulin to now GLP-1 drugs. And so, via a more ETAF lens, what the University of Toronto could have done is they could have limited Eli Lilly and then Nordisk's monopoly power by signing a non-exclusive licensing agreement, saying that we want to make sure that you guys bring these medications to patients at an affordable rate. And we're going to sign a non-exclusive license. We're not going to look for other licensees. We're just going to sign a non-exclusive license with you. But in the event that this medication becomes unaffordable or unavailable, we will work with other companies to bring this drug to the market. They could have included step-in rights, which would have allowed them to step in the event that there was any access breach. Um, a sort of the reason that this is a hypothetical is and a kind of downside of this approach is that patents typically only last 20 years, and so their power over that patent would have only lasted 20 years. But should they have had more, had they worked with potentially more manufacturers and helped more manufacturers enter the insulin business, we might not have seen the same crowding of the market that we see today that's driven up a lot of prices. Um, and let's see. In thinking about the ETAF, we have a handful of suggestions for you guys in terms of how to advocate for the ETAF on your campuses. Our first suggestion is to get in touch with us, the Access team. Each university is different, and we try to work with you guys to get a sense of where your TTO might stand on the matter and devise a strategy to get in touch with them. By way of background, we recommend that you guys read the white paper. And if you read the white paper and feel like you want to learn more about licensing and TTOs, feel free to reach out to us and we can send you some more background resources. Um, I think the biggest bit of advice I have in terms of getting the ETAF or the AAP or anything sort of passed in the university is to try to identify your champions in the TTO or in the campus administration for something like the ETAF to work, where a university is going to have to proactively include these strategies, many of which pharmaceutical companies might not like, in the sense that the licensee would much prefer to retain more of the ownership over the patent than the university. They don't want to have leverage, on them. It's going to take someone who really believes in these principles and who's going to fight for this mission. And that involves identifying a champion on campus who's going to do that. Sometimes that is going to be somebody in the TTO. That's sort of the case at the University of British Columbia. But sometimes the TTOs are going to be resistant, in which case it might actually be better to figure out who the TTO either reports to, who else in the university administration sort of has leverage over the office or can instruct the office to meet certain priorities. That can be like a provost, that can be going to the president. Um, it involves making sure that there's somewhat sustainable way, that there's someone who's going to fight for this policy, who's going to be on campus, because without that, a lot of these policies sort of fall through. Um, Another strategy to get the ETAF passed is to monitor discoveries on campus that are awaiting licensing, to check on your TTO website or to check on the different departmental websites of your university, to see what are the hot new discoveries that have the potential to revolutionize public and global health. And to then be proactive with your TTO to ask them, what are your plans to license this technology? Have you thought about how this is going to impact people in blank country? There's an outbreak of this, say, disease in this country. Do you guys have any plans on bringing the drug to market here? This was actually a strategy that was successful at the University of British Columbia, where a student approached a professor who had developed a new antibiotic. And by sort of asking him questions about how are you going to develop this technology and make sure it's available in low-to income countries, the professor realized, I don't really have a plan. And he got inspired to start thinking about, well, how can I make this a reality? And then so he started working with this TTO, and he founded an organization at UBC called the Neglected Tropical Disease Initiative, to make sure that medications that he's developed, as well as this particular antibiotic, can become available and affordable in low-income countries. And so the obvious step is, of course, to also connect with your tech transfer office. It's also very important to follow up with your TTOs. Ideally, what we would love to see with the ETAF is to present it to a tech transfer officer, to have a discussion over why we think that it could be useful for the university and why it's important for the university's mission, to have them sign on to it, to endorse the plan, or to sort of work with them to maybe create a bespoke access plan for their TTO's needs. That's where we can come in and help you guys, but sometimes TTOs they might say, hey, we love principles 1 through 7. We're not the biggest fans of principle 8. I'm just using this hypothetically. Um, in which case, we want to work with TTOs to be able to get these principles adopted. I believe that all 9 principles can go into these TTOs and be as sustainable licensing practices. But our goal is to work with TTOs to get these frameworks adopted and to then follow up with TTOs to make sure that they're enforced. Um, there was a study recently done by a law professor who looked at how university tech transfer has changed after the 9 points that Vanessa talked about. And after basically looking through university licenses in the 20 years after, or like 15 years after the 9 points, he sort of found that there wasn't actually a big impact from signing on to these statements. Sometimes a university might sign on to one of these, equitable access frameworks because it's great PR, and they might think that it's a great idea, but they might not actually follow through with it. And so it's important for us after getting these policies adopted at universities to also follow through with them and make sure that they're being adopted. And part of that is also being able to provide support, if ever needed, from the TTO if they're having difficulties enforcing any of these principles. That's all we have. That was a lot of information. And so if you guys have any questions, please throw them in the chat or unmute yourselves and we'll answer them here. Um, yeah.
Hey, Sahil. This is Brian. Just wanted to pop in with a quick question. So for let's say we wanted to bring forward the ETAF to our tech transfer office. I guess the way that I have read it in the past is that it's basically sort of a list of suggestions to the office, and a lot of this stuff is going to have to be sort of tailored to the specific license that is being created for any given drug. I mean, I guess like I'm, a lot of this stuff, it seems like it can be interpreted different ways or included in, various, you can include as many or not for any license. So, um, you know, I guess is there a way to like ensure that it's enforced as strongly as possible? And B, like, because it's sort of written in sort of general terms, like should we expect that the tech transfer specialist will know how to transform that into more lawyerly jargon for the actual license?
That's a fantastic question, and I think you bring up two great points. The first being that every drug and every license is to some degree unique in that depending on what the technology is going to inform what the license will look like, where the company is going to choose to commercialize this medication, what the manufacturing process will look like, what, co if cost-based pricing and things like that are reasonable. Um, and for that reason, I think the ETAF's strength is that it's flexible. But then the second point you bring up is that if in being a framework, how can we ensure that a technology transfer office is going to be specific in implementing these clauses the way we would like? Um, I think the way I think about that is two things. Um, First is that I think a lot of the principles are fairly self-evident in terms of what a clause would look like. For example, if we're advocating for a non-exclusive license, well, then we would hope that the technology transfer office would include a non-exclusive license, or that it would include a step-in right, which a handful of universities do, like a humanitarian license. Um, there are other papers that UAM has put together and other people in the space have put together where they propose much more tangible language to be able to better meet these principles. I didn't get to them today because I thought it would be getting a little bit too into the weeds. But if you guys are ever curious about what those specific licensing languages would specifically look like, there are a few papers that I can forward to you guys to be able to look into that. Um, and the only way we can know if the universities or the TTO is meeting this goal is if we have some degree of transparency from them, right? To be able to know that they implemented this license with certain access considerations. And that's why we advocate for greater transparency, ideally for them to potentially post the license at least with the access considerations unredacted. Does that answer your question? Essentially, like we have to sort of be malleable to the specific technology at hand, but a lot of these principles um, um, kind of stand in and of themselves. And I think the tech transfer officers are going to be well aware of what we're specifically advocating for. The question is whether they'll buy our argument and sort of really advocate for this in the licensing negotiations.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thanks so much.
Just wanted to bring attention to some questions in the chat. So the first question is, were there any cases where a university adopted only some of the principles?
So before the ETAF was the GALF, which has the same first two goals, has many of the same principles. The ETAF basically builds out the GALF. So in a sense, yes, some of the principles have been adopted by, I believe, the one university that adopted the GALF, which is McGill. There may have been other universities. I'm not sure. Um, The ETAF was written in 2020. Then the pandemic hit, and I think a lot of UAM's focus then pivoted to the pandemic response and then also to work with AAP. There haven't been that many chapters advocating for the ETAF on their campuses. And so one of the reasons we put this webinar together was because we want to start redirecting attention back to the ETAF as well, and to get universities to start considering it. Um, I don't think a ETAF has been adopted even in part or in full. Um, but the GALF has been adopted before, if you're looking for precedent.
And another question in the chat, is there a case where there is student slash UAM involvement on oversight of implementation slash interpretation of these principles within a TTO?
Not to my knowledge, that's something we would hope to establish by building a relationship with ATTL.
And then last question in the chat, what resources, whether they be legal, educational, or institutional, can ETAF provide or connect us with to help build legal support teams? For example, law student interns, patent bar certified attorneys, and advocate for transparency in tech transfer.
That's a very good question. Um, there are resources that we can forward to you. I think, let's see. The I would say that the main sort of value proposition we provide to universities is the idea that universities haven't done enough to increase global access to their medicines, and that we believe that universities can kind of go through this approach of market segmentation, where they can continue to allow their companies, the licensees, to continue to make most of their revenue in high income countries. We just want them to also compel the licensees to have their due diligence in bringing these drugs to low income markets, where they're typically not going to be making that much money anyways. There isn't really much money to be made or much money to be lost because these are not the main drivers of their revenue. And so I think one of the challenges of this work is that it can be very technical. And we can always forward you resources to sort of educate yourselves on this. It always helps to have someone who has maybe some understanding of law. There are also some other sort of groups in this space that we can connect you with who have sort of industry leading experts in access to medicines who can come and speak on behalf of UAEM once you guys open the door for negotiations. But fundamentally, I think our value proposition is that this is a pretty simple idea. Just let these drugs be produced in low and middle income countries where they're needed most. You're never going to make that much money in that market to begin with. And we just want to facilitate that process because as of now, pharmaceutical companies have little interest in doing that. And so I think, yeah, it's a balance of, wanting to learn more, but also realizing that we're arguing for a fairly simple, clean idea. It's just about making sure that universities take this idea seriously.
And then another question in the chat, what are some common misconceptions TTOs have that may discourage them from pursuing the adoption of the ETAF that we should clarify?
I think the biggest misconception that I see is that UAM is somehow anti-patent or anti sort of any part of the tech transfer office, any sort of tech transfer process. Um, Sometimes I think TTOs think that I suppose a good way to explain this is to think of the problem through the perspective of the TTO. The TTO's job is to make sure that a technology that was invented at a university is commercialized so that this technology that was developed can eventually go and help patients and help people. Um, It's a fairly difficult process of finding someone who's going to commercialize this, early stage technology and invest in it and bring it to the market. So from their point of view, they can often be very worried that anything that they do to try to coerce the licensee or maybe put pressure on them might deter them from working with them. And that'll mean from their point of view that this technology that nobody's going to develop and this technology is going to stay on the shelf to help nobody. And so, what TTOs are often worried about is that if they start including clauses like, I don't know, something like a non-exclusive license is a pretty good example. A lot of pharmaceutical companies will say, no, we want an exclusive license. We don't want anyone else to produce this. And they might even say, if it's not a non-exclusive, if it's not an exclusive license, then, we might not even be at this table. Um, and so from a TTO's perspective, they're getting a lot of pressure to sort of yield to the interests of the pharmaceutical company. And so the a common misconception is that we're kind of coming in and we're too naive, perhaps, to see that this is a very complicated business transaction that requires a lot of, fragility and a lot of care. I think all those things are true. I think we need to approach this carefully, but I also think that they can do better to, make sure that they're not fully just rolling over to the interests of the company to be able to provide the support and the assurance that they can work with them and that they can create a commercially viable product in high-income countries, but that there can also be room to, produce this drug in low and middle-income countries if it's possible.
And if anyone has any more questions, feel free to type in the chat or just unmute yourself and ask.
I'm curious about you guys. By show of hands, how many of you guys have ever met with a TTO officer or your TTO officer? Let's see. Okay. Um, I'm going to stop the recording.